Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all. My name is Stephen Wagner, and I am a program associate at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the final program in our China Town Hall series, with today's focus on global health and climate change. Thank you all for taking the time to join us for this important conversation as our wonderful panelists explore these critical areas of the relationship. We really hope to have your input, so I want to remind everyone that if you have a question for our panel, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now, without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our moderator, Merit Janow. Merit is Dean of the Faculty and Professor of the Practice at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. She also serves on our Board of Directors here at the National Committee. Merit, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Welcome, everyone. Delighted to be with you. It's my privilege to moderate this evening's discussion. And let me briefly introduce our really extraordinary panelists. I will be brief, so we have more time for discussion. But really, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Margaret Hamburg, an internationally recognized leader in public health and medicine. She's a former commissioner of the US FDA, where she served almost 6 years in the Obama administration. She was also an assistant secretary for planning and evaluation in the US Department of Health and Human Services, and also had experience in New York City, where she was health commissioner. And she's also worked at NIH and also been very, very active with the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. So Dr. Hamburg, Peggy, delighted to have you with us. Thank you very much. Also with us is Ryan Haas, a fellow and the Michael Armacost Chair in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, where he also holds a joint appointment to the John L. Thornton China Center and the Center for East Asian Policy Studies. He was in the inaugural class of the David Rubenstein Fellows at Brookings and is also a non-affiliated fellow at the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale Law School. Importantly, he served as director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in the National Security Council from 2013 to 2017 and advised President Obama and senior White House officials on all aspects of US policy in the region. Ryan, wonderful to have you here as well. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Angel Hsu, who's Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies at Yale National University of Singapore College, and the founder and director of the Data-Driven Enviro Policy Lab, which is a very interdisciplinary policy research group that applies quantitative approaches to pressing environmental issues. And you bring together both science and public policy and the use of data-driven approaches to look at questions of environmental sustainability, particularly with respect to climate and energy, air quality, and urbanization. So wonderful to have you with us, Professor Hsu, as well. So if you don't mind, we'll jump right in with a health question, which I'd like to direct to Peggy. I think, we're all so focused on COVID-19, of course, at this time, but it would be wonderful if you could help orient us to understand from your perspective how we should think about the state of US-China collaboration in medicine and health before COVID-19 as well as after. Some have said this has been historically or in recent years something of a bright spot in collaboration between the United States and China, but clearly taken a very tough turn in the last year. Help us think about what is the state of collaboration and cooperation, information exchange around health and science.
Well, I so appreciate being part of this panel, this important set of topics, and the opportunity to talk with you. Health science and medical collaboration between the US and China has been longstanding and very important. And it's manifested in many different ways. There's been the sort of scientist to scientist, physician to physician collaboration that's been very important, whether it is trainees coming to this country to pursue aspects of their education and work early in their careers, and then long-standing connections between those individuals, even when they go back to China, or collaborations in specific areas of research and public health and medical practice. I would say that, in many ways, the US has been very important in helping to shape aspects of the current public health, medical, and scientific environment in China. I might be overstating, but some of the areas I know best, there's the scientific training I was just talking about, and many outstanding scientists in China today did spend some time training here in this country. In addition, though, some of the key public health and science-based agencies in China are important partners to us, and actually have shaped their activities along the lines of our activities with the Chinese CDC, which was begun actually after the SARS outbreak back 2003, and the Chinese FDA, which now has another name, but very much developed over time with interactions with our FDA and other regulatory authorities, but to try to learn from us and build from the best possible models. And in the meantime, with this work together, and actually people from the US going over there and being embedded in their agencies, et cetera, has built lasting relationships and important understandings about how the work is done, what kind of work is done, and opportunities for collaboration. COVID has certainly brought into focus some of the important issues where collaboration is necessary. There have been, some challenges and deficiencies. I think that's true. There have also been enormous successes, and I just have to mention one, which is in this last week, we've gotten enormously promising news about the development of COVID vaccines that may actually be authorized soon for broader use. There's never been vaccine development this rapid. We didn't even know about this novel coronavirus as 2020 began, and we have a vaccine that may become more broadly available within a year. That could not have happened if the Chinese scientists who were struggling to understand this emerging and unusual respiratory disease outbreak within their country hadn't posted the fruits of their science, the genome of this new coronavirus, on the web for scientists in this country and around the world to benefit from. And that was fundamental to the advances in biomedical research and new medical product development that have occurred. And that's one reflection of this area of advancing biomedical product development, is another important area of collaboration. And there's much more that we can talk about as the session goes forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think that's a lot for us to think about and get us started. Let me turn to another area where it would seem that the US and China would have a lot that we need to collaborate on, and that's around climate and the environment. If I could turn to Professor Hsu, at the time of the Paris Accord, I think I remember well the fact that the US and China had agreed on some important steps in advance of Paris was seen as instrumental to the Paris Accord going forward. And of course, the US and China are the two largest, emitters. And intriguing, both President Xi at the UN, spoke about being carbon neutral, set a goal of 2060, and recently President-elect has also identified a goal of net zero by 2050. So I guess I'm inviting you to share with us how do you assess what China has done in recent years, and is it continuing to advance an aggressive agenda, or with Paris sort of under strain by the US pulling out and so forth? Has it slowed everyone down? Or how do you assess what China has been doing?
Well, thank you so much, Merit, for that question. And thanks so much to the committee for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. And exactly as you said, Merit, I don't think I can underscore how important the US-China relationship on climate change was to securing the Paris Agreement. So someone who has long been following and an observer at these international climate negotiations dating back to 2009 when there was the Copenhagen climate negotiations, and that was a really watershed moment. And then we saw US and China's relation really strained by conversations and how that whole agreement unfolded. And so then to basically turn into a 180 and have the two largest emitters responsible for almost 40% of global emissions come together in 2014, Presidents Obama and Xi say, we're going to break this mutual impasse between our two countries and actually work together, because we have to work together in order to solve global climate change. And so that was really instrumental to building the confidence amongst other governments, particularly developing countries, India, Brazil, to also come in and engage in the Paris Agreement. And so it would have never passed if it weren't for the US and China laying important groundwork to come together to do something on climate change. And so that being said, it's been incredibly disappointing to see then the US government essentially retreat from the Paris Agreement. So one of the first things that President Trump did when he came into office was to say, we're going to remove the US from the Paris Agreement. And of course, that took a while to happen. That actually happened last week. And President-elect Biden, fortunately, has said the first thing that he wants to do is to re-engage into that climate change agreement, because we have lost a lot of time. And simply, if we look at the science, we only have this last decade. We only have the next 10 years to really reverse course. We're currently headed way off track and headed towards a 3.5, 4 degrees Celsius warming world when we need to contain that to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And so we essentially need to implement ambitious action. So we've lost a lot of time, I think, on ambition. And that's one of the reasons why what you mentioned during the UN General Assembly at the end of September was tremendous for China to come out ahead and to say that they want to commit to carbon neutrality by 2060 or sooner. That was really tremendous, because traditionally we haven't seen China come forth and be a leader on climate change and environmental issues in this way. It's traditionally been in the context of bilateral agreements with the United States, for example. And so for China to just come out unilaterally and say, we're not going to wait for the US and to see what happens with the outcome of the US election, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to commit, because this is something that's important for us to address concerns of air quality, energy security, climate change impacts, vulnerability, for example. And we know that coal cannot be a part of our energy mix for much longer, and to actually phase out coal by 2050, because that's essentially what they have to do in order to meet that carbon neutrality target. And currently around 68% of the energy mix is still derived from coal. And so that's going to require an enormous amount of effort. So the challenge is really, I think, ahead for China. But the good news is that they have continued to make progress despite what the US has not been doing on climate change. They have continued to make progress on climate change. They're on track to meeting their Paris climate target, which admittedly is not that ambitious. And so independent analysis by the Climate Action Tracker project has shown that China's efforts alone are not going to be enough to lead us to that 2 degrees or that 1.5 degree path. But at least they have not reneged on their climate change efforts, and they've continued to push on clean energy, on research and development in clean energy, increased targets domestically for consuming more solar and wind energy, for example. So at least that's encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, we'll come back. I think this is very, very important. Ryan, you have seen from the White House the whole picture of US-China relations, economic and security, and you've certainly had visibility into these core areas of tonight's focus on health and the environment, and ones that in theory are transnational issues that countries can't solve by themselves, and where collaboration where it can be found is really, really powerful. So what's your assessment of the progress that has been achieved, and do you perceive it as being fundamentally derailed or there to be seized going forward?
Well, first of all, Merit, thank you for leading us through this discussion. It's really an honor for me to be with you and Peggy and Angel, and I appreciate the National Committee bringing us all together. I should start by stating the obvious, which is that I'm neither a climate nor a health expert, so I will be modest in my opinions on those issues and largely defer to Peggy and Angel to talk about them. But like you mentioned, I do have a perspective. I've been around the relationship for a while, and I think that I can try to help situate where these issues fit within the relationship. And the first thought I'd like to offer in response to your question is that I find it rather extraordinary that in recent years, the United States and China have struggled so mightily to deal together with climate change and COVID-19. I feel like COVID-19 in a way has held a mirror up to the relationship, and the picture that has come back isn't pretty. It has shown that even in instances where the lives of Americans and Chinese are at stake, both of our countries are allowing tensions and sort of political dynamics to impede what should be a pretty active space for cooperation. And so the question that I have right now is whether this moment is a precursor of a long-term trend or a short-term aberration. And I'm going to try to make an optimistic case tonight that we will find ways to restore functionality and cooperation and coordination on some of these issues in the relationship. But I have to be honest that I'm making this case more out of optimism than certainty. But I make the case based upon sort of the following assumptions. The first assumption is that both countries have spent a lot of effort in recent years to achieve the level of dysfunction and toxicity that exists in the relationship. I don't expect that it will be in either side's interest to sustain the current downward dive angle of the relationship into the future. And second, and relatedly, I'm of the view that over the long term, countries' actions are guided by their identification of their national interest. And I think that we can make a pretty persuasive case, and Angel and Peggy already have begun to tonight, that it is in both of our countries' national interest to find ways to work together and to spur collective action to address some of these threats that neither country can address on its own, but that both will be impacted negatively by if left unaddressed. And so I still think that it's possible to restore and regain some of the muscle memory that had been building prior to 2017. And we saw, if you think back, there was a pattern that was becoming pretty well grouped, whether it was over Sudan or the global financial crisis or the Ebola outbreak or the Paris Climate Accord or building capacity around peacekeeping. Our two countries, two major powers, were able to come together when the circumstances demanded it and take action. I don't want to glorify those experiences because they often underperformed and they often required much more effort than should have been necessary. But nevertheless, I think that we can make a persuasive case that a clear pattern was emerging. And I'm confident that pattern can be reestablished going forward.
Good. Well, thank you. We'll come back and push you on that a little bit about how do we operationalize that. Let me go back to Peggy, and you made that really encouraging comment about vaccine development and the rapidity and the contribution of China in making the genome available that helped accelerate science around the world. China has also, I think, indicated its intention to roll out vaccine in the developing world as a matter of both science and foreign policy priorities. Can you share, do you know what is that homegrown vaccine development, or is there an area where the US and China are cooperating today around vaccine development? I have the impression that there's very little cooperation directly occurring, but that may not be true. I'm afraid you're on mute.
You would think I would have learned how to unmute on Zoom by now. But the vaccines that are now in use in China and some other parts of the world have been developed within China by Chinese-based companies. And I in all honesty, I think that it would be great if there could be a little bit more transparency into how those vaccines have been developed and the testing. that's been done and the existing data, it did seem that they accelerated some aspects of the vaccine clinical trial process more than we would have anticipated. There's been a great challenge for all of us in terms of how do you accelerate the vaccine R&D process without cutting corners that might harm our ability to truly assess efficacy and, importantly, safety. Because with vaccines, you have to remember you're giving it to people who are otherwise healthy to protect them from getting a disease. So you care about efficacy, but you really care about safety because you don't want to make healthy people sick. So I wish there was more transparency, and I think there's opportunities for more collaboration going forward in terms of what have we learned about medical product development, including vaccines, and also about public health. There's a lot that's been happening, going back to the sort of scientist to scientist relationships and the scientific organization to scientific organization as well. I've been involved in very productive discussions around vaccine issues and many other issues through the Chinese Academy of Science and the US National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And, I applaud those activities, and they have enabled us to engage at very high levels and with great expertise. But there still are constraints in some aspects of the relationship that I think as we go forward, we need to work on in order to really take greater advantage of science as a global enterprise. And there are great minds in China and great minds here. But also, I do think that it is really important in these key areas of medical products that as much as possible that we do adhere to the same, general set of standards and approaches. Because if a vaccine from China turns out to be less safe than hoped for or anticipated, it can undermine the whole vaccine enterprise much more broadly. And the same is true, if something happens here, it has reverberations there. So we all really, in this scientific community and public health community, I think understand that we have an opportunity to find better solutions working together because of collaboration and the pooling of intellectual resources and other resources, but also that we have an obligation to be as responsible as possible in what we actually produce from these scientific efforts and how they are appropriately used.
Mm-hmm. Could you say, before we leave this subject, could you just say another word, on where you think, where the vehicles are for becoming as transparent as possible? Is it doctor to doctor? Is it association by association? If you're trying to imagine building confidence in increasing transparency, how is that going to happen? Is it operationalized? Is it through the medical associations, professionals, or do you need other entities to be created to do this? Is the World Health Organization the vehicle that we should be hoping becomes more active? How do we think about this actually maturing?
Yeah, well, I think it should be a multifaceted approach, because I think that we really want to be able to have governmental agency to governmental agency collaboration and transparency, but we also want to have a very open and thriving scientific collaboration that can happen through research institutions and medical care institutions, can happen through individuals working together, and it can happen through scientific organizations and professional societies working together. I think all of that is important. One thing that I do know is that it was very, very valuable at an earlier time when there were US professionals from the CDC and the FDA who are actually working in China interacting every day with their officials and their professionals. And, it gave us, much greater insight into activities that were underway. It also gave us an opportunity to really collaborate. And it gave us, I think, a much stronger platform to build the kind of trust and confidence that we need going forward.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Let me turn to Angel and ask you a similar kind of question. I mean, I think what you spoke to was the need to develop sort of shared understandings and approaches and mechanisms for decarbonization pathways. And it's clearly a collective action problem. So, and you said we've lost time. So how do you think we create incentives for more action earlier? Is it just a question of, do we, do actions in the US, we're talking about a host of actions being talked about by the president-elect. Do you imagine those having a catalytic effect on China? How do you imagine the dynamic working to create incentives for action earlier? Is there anything that can be done to do that?
Well, I want to go back to what Peggy was saying, because actually when she was speaking, I was furiously taking notes, because I think so many of the things that she pointed to, a multifaceted approach, science to science exchange, industry associations, public-private dialogues, all of this that applies to health, these same types of exchanges also apply to climate and energy and environmental cooperation. And so I remember in several of my years spent living in Beijing, one of the best exchanges that I ever participated in were the regional air quality management seminars and exchanges by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and also the State Environmental Protection Agency, now MEP and now MEEP for Ecology and Environmental Protection. So that, I think all of that still applies. And thankfully, in the last 4 years, even though at the highest national levels, there hasn't been that same type of engagement between the two countries, on the lower levels, there still has been exchange. And so I think about, for example, in my work, looking specifically at the role of state governments and subnational actors that also have been instrumental in helping to implement the Paris Agreement and continuing action on climate change. And so the good news is that that kind of exchange has still happened in the last 4 years. In 2018, former California Governor Jerry Brown hosted this Global Climate Action Summit specifically to call attention to the role that city governments, local actors, and businesses can play in helping to drive climate action. And so he invited a huge delegation from China, and they had a China pavilion on the sidelines of this larger summit to continue that exchange. And more than a dozen MOUs, memorandums of understanding, were signed between then Governor Jerry Brown and the Chinese counterparts. And so they were signing agreements on emissions trading. So to facilitate exchange, California has had their own state level emissions trading scheme for several years now. And of course, China has been experimenting with regional schemes, and they launched a national scheme last year. And so that kind of exchange has been important also on clean energy vehicles, zero emissions vehicles. All of this exchange happened in 2018 and continues to happen. And so I think that's a way that we can feel hopeful that when we have a shift in administration, that all of the pieces have not just completely been lost and everything hasn't been stagnant. I think we can look towards these subnational exchanges and these person-to-person, scientist-to-scientist, organization exchanges to help immediately re-engage. And then I think at the international level, just having President-elect Biden say that he wants to commit the US to become also carbon neutral by 2050. And then also he is talking about developing a cabinet level climate change position within his administration. I mean, that would all go a really long way, because I think even though there still has been this bottom up and these multi-leveled exchanges that have still occurred, we still need to have the high level coordination in order to provide those incentives that you mentioned. And so if in order for us to move rapidly, I think that's still a really critical part. And so I'm personally looking forward to seeing how we can tie all these things together in the next several years and try to regain some of that ground that we've lost.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. That's very helpful. May I ask you a kind of framing question, though? I mean, one might think that in this period of COVID-19, when there's been such a drop in economic activity, that there would have been a significant decline in emissions. But I'm hearing that's not the case, in China. Do you have the data around that? Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Because of the economic shutdown measures, there were actually the greatest dip in emissions that we've seen since in modern times. So certainly prior, even when you compare economic depression events, still emissions achieved the lowest drops that the world has ever seen. In April, on some days, emissions dropped as much as 25% globally on a given day because of economic shutdown measures. And so I think there was a lot of discussion in the circles that I run in that, this could be really tremendous. This could give us that moment of reset. If we look at the end of the year, the projections and the models are looking like the total impact on emissions will be around 4%. So right now it was kind of hovering between 7 and 12% at the height of the shutdown period. But now it looks like, because economies have opened up, China's including, and we see already in the data looking at China's emissions that they also achieved record emissions reductions. But then when the economy started to open back up, they bounced right back. And so the models are similarly assuming that same thing is going to happen for other governments as well. So we may expect at the end of the year around 4% as the median scenario for overall emissions reductions, which would still be huge if you consider the past couple years since 2017, we've seen an uptick in global emissions, and that's largely been driven by China and China's own economic stimulus, and also from the industrial sectors, a kick up in emissions, and then also with additional coal-fired power plants coming online and more coal-fired power plants also in the line. So that has been disappointing in the last couple of years to see emissions go up. But what it amounts to, if we look at what we need to do, which is to have global emissions by 2030, we're going to need to have a COVID size impact on emissions reductions every year for the next 10 years if we're going to meet our goals. So that just gives you some type of way to frame the enormity of the challenge ahead of us. And we know that if we look at 2008 and the impact on global emissions then, it was nowhere near to the same magnitude as we've already experienced. And emissions also went back up. They rebounded as well after the global financial crisis in 2008. So the hope is that we can take this moment and we can take a pause and say, okay, well, we have these goals of economic recovery, of securing climate justice, and also addressing climate change, reducing emissions. How can we do those things all together? And so I'm also really encouraged by the framing of a Green New Deal. And so Senator Markey and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced this idea of we don't have to sacrifice economic growth for climate or environmental goals and vice versa. We can actually achieve them together. And I think the same framing has resonance also in China, where you talk about the need to shift millions of workers out of heavy polluting industries such as iron and steel, and also coal, for example. And so what would just transition look like also in the Chinese context? And I think that's also an opportunity where the US and China can really learn from each other and work together on similar challenges.
So Ryan, we've been talking now very much in, actions taken in China or in the United States or in collaboration. But one of the interesting themes of the president-elect is that he's going to do differently is work with our allies. And, I think some of the subtext of that is work with our allies on a host of issues, including with respect to China. And concerns that we might share. And I'm just wondering if you think about the scope for working with our allies vis-a-vis China on the matters we're discussing, health and climate. Is that a vehicle, you think, for advancing shared progress?
Well, it's a great question, and I very much agree with your sentiment, Merit, that the president-elect seems very focused on trying to aggregate the voices of our allies for dealing with the challenges that China poses. And I think that there's a lot of scope for that to be done. But I would hate for that focus to come at the expense of working with China on some of these issues, because I think it has to be a both and approach rather than an either or approach. And I think that there are a few practical ways that we could sort of get things back on track in terms of moving forward coordination with China on both health and climate issues. And I'll just offer a few very briefly. The first is to have our leaders focus on facts, focus on problems that need to be solved, be clear-eyed, and maybe leave the mudslinging to others. Secondly, I think that it would be healthy for both sides to acknowledge that it is possible to cooperate with competitors. I think the relationship between the United States and China is fundamentally competitive, will remain fundamentally competitive, but that really doesn't need to be an impediment to our two countries' ability to cooperate when it serves both of our interests to do so. Next, or third, I think that we in the United States are going to need to approach these discussions with the Chinese as a peer-to-peer discussion. It's not a teacher-to-student discussion. It's not a leader-to-subordinate discussion. Both countries have material capacity that they can bring to bear to deal with these issues, and we're going to need to approach it in that matter. And then the final thought that I would just leave with is something that sort of piggybacks on what Peggy and Angel were just talking about, which is that to the extent that our experts, our scientists, our researchers can help us identify scope and pace for progress on some of these issues, I think that will be much healthier than having politicians really making decisions around cooperation on these issues and using them as sort of a light switch mood marker of whether or not we're happy or disgruntled with China. And so the more that we can get our scientists and our experts sitting down next to each other, working together, the higher the confidence I'm going to have about our two countries' capacity to cooperate.
Well, let me ask you, push you a little bit, because you made an earlier comment about how cooperation and competition were both attributes of the relationship, and that we had been moving down a path where there's increasing tension and even some decoupling. So, I think there's been a lot of discussion about the effects of this COVID-19 crisis also on supply chain, and how, we had to be building more at home, whether it's around clean tech or it's PPE in the medical area. We had to be more mindful of what has to be done at home. So there are lots of contrary trends going on now. So if you think about the last few years and the period that we're still in, are there areas that you think we have to be more inward looking and protective, even as we try and explore new areas for cooperation? Absolutely.
And I don't think it's unreasonable for the United States to want to feel secure in its access to things like PPE. And if I could just borrow an idea from your colleague, Tom Christensen, Tom talks a lot about how in the United States assures itself of its energy security by having an oil reserve, a strategic petroleum reserve. I think that a similar concept could be applied in some of the areas that you described, whether it's PPE or vaccines, et cetera. That would give us confidence and comfort to be able to engage on some of these issues without feeling vulnerability that leads to defensiveness and sort of a zero-sum I win, you lose attitude towards what really are effectively shared problems that threaten all of humanity.
Mm-hmm. Peggy, I wonder if you wanted to comment in this area. I mean, whether, again, this period, it's filled with ironies, of course. Some of the areas where we imposed tariffs later became a real problem because it included PPE equipment that we needed in the crisis. But are there things that we should be sure to be producing at home? Do you think about those questions?
Well, I do. And certainly when I was commissioner of the FDA, I was really startled when I learned just how much of what the FDA was responsible for regulating was being made in whole or in part in other countries. And a lot of it was in China. And this was true on the drug and device side, as well as on the food side. And, it is the case that most of the active pharmaceutical ingredients in drugs used in the United States actually come from China and other important medical products are made in China or partially. So we need to look at that. And, one of the things that we worked hard with our Chinese colleagues on was trying to find ways both to enhance their regulatory oversight of these products to ensure standards of quality and performance, but also how to work together to better assure the supply chain. We always recognize that there would be vulnerabilities with certain kind of dislocations that could be a political crisis or some kind of natural crisis, a weather or geological crisis, or a pandemic crisis. So I think as we're coming out of COVID, we have to be careful not to be too reactive and say, bring it all to the US. But I think we do have to think strategically about, what can be done here and what should be done here, but also how to still work on this collaboration and greater transparency around existing strategies and find ways to upgrade some of what currently is in place. And again, this isn't a uniquely US concern. Other countries have these same concerns, and there needs to be more global governance around all of this, I think. But I think it would be a huge mistake to think that we could and should do it all in the US. People would be very surprised what that would mean. It would mean skyrocketing of prices, for one thing, but it would also mean vulnerabilities of a different kind, because there could be problems, here. And if we have everything based in one set of facilities here in the US, it might make us safer in certain kinds of crises, but it also could make us very vulnerable. So I think we need a distributed approach. We need a thoughtful approach. We need an approach that recognizes that countries do have very distinct needs, but that we also, for better or for worse, exist in a globalized world, and that in fact, most of the challenges before us, big picture, certainly are shared problems where the only way to find solutions is to work together. And I think that the fact that we have to learn to work together to solve those problems means we ought to also work on working together to address other more routine concerns. And I think we can do it. And we should do it. But I was very struck by what Ryan said. I too was taking notes, because one of the things we do is have to focus on facts, and we have to look at the realities of the world that we live in, instead of the sort of caricatures that get created and the sort of boogeymen and acting on fears or past hostilities. There is no way we can make progress on health or climate change, or the important intersection of climate change and health, unless we focus on the facts and we cooperate and we recognize that while we may be competitive nations on many fronts, that science doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. If we work together to solve these problems, we will all benefit. And if we don't work together, we all will suffer. So I think we have to keep pounding on those points that Ryan made, and the notion that we need to think about it peer-to-peer, I think, is also very, very important. And I do think that, China, I'm not a China scholar, but I've worked, these issues with Chinese colleagues, and, they have a huge amount to offer. They have sought to learn from us in many ways, but we have also learned from them hugely, and we have to continue to find those ways to develop the mutual collaboration and mutual respect that's needed in our modern world.
Thank you very much. That's a very, very powerful argument. And I think as we are really entering a national debate that will continue the next few years about what does resilience in a supply chain mean, this is really very important insights. I'm going to open it up to turn to some of the questions that we've gotten. But before we leave the environment, I sort of feel, Angel, we haven't talked about coal, and that's been a real concern, I think, about China still building coal plants both at home and through the BRI initiative. Any word on what you think the prospects are for addressing that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of the greatest pain points, I think, for someone who studies China's environment and climate change. And I'm also an optimist like Ryan. and China has made incredible strides over the last several decades in reducing the energy intensity of its growth and cleaning up air pollution in many of the major cities, and really increasing the amount of solar and wind that it not only consumes, but also in terms of the technology that it exports, and has also brought down the price of, and going back to Peggy's point about the cost of some of these PPE and medical supplies that might be that would go up if it weren't for China's cooperation. And then I think a point also that many like to point to is the fact that China has been investing and supporting and exporting a lot of the excess coal capacity domestically to other parts of the world, particularly Southeast Asia, actually where I am now. And we're feeling the effects of it on a seasonal basis when we get horrible air pollution and transboundary haze from other parts of Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia. But what has been encouraging, so on Monday at a European Business Forum, I was following the streaming, and it sounds like Shi Zhenhua, who was the former head of the Chinese climate change delegation, he did say that this was unsustainable and that China certainly cannot make good on its climate goals or be seen as a global leader, or even, I think, in good faith, commit to this carbon neutrality target if they continue to support coal overseas. And so that to me was incredibly encouraging. It was the first time that I heard a high-level Chinese leader say something explicitly about the need to actually stop supporting and exporting this coal technology. And so this is why I mentioned before that I think the notion of a just transition is really critical in the Chinese context, not just in the US context, but also in China, where you're going to have to find some alternatives for both workers who are employed in these industries and also businesses that their livelihoods depend on exporting a lot of this technology, or at least having some use for this technology if it's not domestically or abroad. And so this is a challenge that China is grappling with right now. But I personally was very encouraged to hear that the Chinese leadership is really starting to think about it. I think there's been a lot of pressure on the international community. But then I think also being here in Southeast Asia, I see that there still is a lot of demand for cheap power. And unfortunately, coal is affordable, it's cheap. And even though we've seen the price of solar go down quite a lot due to China, I think there's still a lot of resistance and a lot of path-dependent processes that still lock in some of these fossil fuel technologies for at least the near to midterm. And so I think also there needs to be more engagement in broader Southeast Asia, where we see the most growth in coal and the expected growth in coal for the next several years. And so I think I think China has fairly received a lot of the criticism, but I think also there needs to be more efforts, I think regionally, to also have countries here in Southeast Asia commit to carbon neutrality or similar decarbonization goals, and recognize that coal simply can't be part of that pathway.
Thank you. We've gotten a couple more questions this evening that are really aimed at climate issues, and really, Angel, I don't want to make you have to answer all of them. Ryan may have some views on some of this as well. You know, the one line of questioning is really what kind of leverage does the international community have in kind of encouraging shifts of perspective or incentives in China, you know, at the local level, because often, party officials at the local level have to meet, local targets and local incentives, and so you need to get pretty specific, and that's sort of something I think Angel's been thinking about, but probably Ryan has as well. Another kind of set of questions is really about about how much kind of greenwashing is going on in China, making things look green, but or look like they're taking climate commitment seriously, but without really doing so. I mean, that's a criticism I think that could be directed at many places, but I wonder, Ryan, if you'd like to speak to either of those.
Well, thank you, Merit. I will be extremely brief because I want to cede most of my time to Angel, who I think will have a much better perspective on these questions than me. But one of the things that I served in U.S. Embassy Beijing for 4 years and had a chance to travel around the country during that period. And one of the things that I was really struck by was sort of how chaotic and messy China really is. So it's easy standing outside of China to develop this perception of Xi Jinping making every decision and governing every action inside China. When you go to different provinces and municipalities, you realize how messy the process is. There are hundreds of different laboratories inside China trying to figure out how to meet the targets that the central government has set. And the reason I make that point is because I think it provides space for the subnational cooperation to really have meaning, to inject ideas at a subnational level that are given a chance to be tested and potentially scale inside China. And so I think that there is a breadcrumb trail process that is possible. But I also think that at the same time, it's very important for the United States, as we were talking about earlier, to have a lot of commonality of purpose and sort of a chorus effect in really pushing the Chinese to up the scale of their ambition and to meet the ambitious targets that they're set. So those would be sort of the two angles of approach that would come to mind for me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Angel, would you like to is there anything specific that can be done to shift incentives at the local level?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Ryan 100%. And I would say that whoever asked this question really hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think this is the reason why people say that China is often the land of contradictions, exactly as Ryan said, where you could have the central leadership saying climate change is really important and we're going to adopt these binding targets for climate change and energy within our 5-year plans. But then at the local level, you have local governments that clearly have a misalignment of incentives, and they have local economies and GDP targets in order to achieve. And so they continue to prop up coal-fired power plants and local industries that are very polluting. I think one of the encouraging signs in this year of COVID on the part of the national leadership was to not specify for the first time even an aspirational or a soft target for GDP at the national level. And so I think that should help to shift some of the incentives at the local scale to emphasize more high quality growth that is less polluting and that is more sustainable in the long run. But yeah, that's exactly one of the reasons, especially when China, the central government, allowed for more local approvals of coal-fired power plants. I mean, that's one of the reasons why now we see this huge uptick. I think the latest count was something around 250 gigawatts of coal-fired power that's either being constructed right now or that is planned to be constructed. That's more coal-fired capacity than the US has in total, and also in India. And so I think until we are able to better align those incentives, I think that you're going to continue to see this mismatch where you have the central government committing and saying one thing and the local government doing something different. For the greenwashing point, I think that's quite interesting because Merit, I think you're right that you can apply that to companies and actors all over the world. And this is something that in my work in looking at the role of subnational and non-state climate actors, I've gotten a lot. And so in working directly with the Paris government and the UN Climate Secretariat in the lead up to Paris, they specifically said, we want to have data and really understand and be able to quantify and know what these actors are doing and whether or not they're implementing their actions, because we're really concerned that if there's greenwashing happening and not actual implementation of these targets and these goals, it's going to risk credibility to the whole climate change movement. And I will say in China, I feel like there is less risk of this greenwashing because of the added accountability of these central government targets that are binding, that have been adopted as part of the 5-year plans. And as Ryan said, then are passed on to the provinces and to the local governments to then actually implement. And so looking at the data, at least we can see that these actions are being implemented, the targets are being met. But then that goes back to the question that I alluded to in the beginning, which is there has been criticism in hindsight that these targets were never that ambitious to begin with. And so that's why I think having this 2060 long-term target, and we see in the environmental management and policy literature and evidence that when you have these long-term targets and these policies, that can really help to coordinate and motivate and to align those incentives to get the whole of society moving towards a common goal.
Thank you. Peggy, I'd like to go back. I mean, there's so much to discuss around health issues. I feel you've started us opening our minds, but we could really spend the whole evening talking about health. And we're at the point in our program where I think we need to invite each of you to offer recommendations from a leadership perspective. What would you recommend to leaders in either country or both that would be concrete, practical steps that we might take to do just as you say, to improve the relationship and build cooperation frameworks. Could you get us started thinking in an ambitious but practical way?
Well, thank you. And it ties into, I really wanted to comment on what Angel had been saying. And, I mean, this may not be realistic, but I think we should put health at the center for both broader issues of health and climate change in the environment. Because at the end of the day, health really matters to people. It really matters also to economies and productivity and to safety and security of communities and of nations. And I really do think, my sense in China is that part of what has galvanized the Chinese government, maybe I'm naive, but is that civil society started to really care, not because of the potential for ocean rise or the bleaching of coral reefs, but because they could see the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation on their health. Air pollution, mercury in the water, all kinds of things that were impacting their safety, health, and well-being. The same is true in the US in motivating people to really think about and care about climate change. In this period when we are so focused on health and disease because of COVID, it's a powerful moment, I think, to really remind people both about the importance of looking at the facts and acting them, not being complacent, not pretending that problems will go away if we shove them under the rug, but act on the facts before us to address critical challenges that matter on this fundamental level and beyond. And then also the importance of bringing science to bear and really harnessing science and technology in the service of people and society and the future of both of our nations and our planet.
Thank you so much. I think we are very short on time, so let me invite Ryan and Angel to answer the same question, 1 minute each.
I will, thank you. I will be very brief. My hope or my suggestion would be for our leaders to develop sort of a clear-eyed understanding of the fundamental nature of the relationship. The United States is not going to change China. China is not going to change the United States. We're two big, powerful countries that are going to have to interact with each other. I think that we're locked in a relationship of competitive interdependence. It's fundamentally competitive, but as Peggy was saying, there is an inherent interdependence. If we work together to solve some of these problems, we will all benefit. If we ignore challenges or refuse to work with each other, we will all suffer. And so from sort of a clear-eyed view of the relationship, I think that space may emerge for us to deal with some of these challenges.
Thank you very much. Angel, you have the last recommendation.
Wow, this is the pressure's on. I would again just emphasize my co-panelists' excellent points. Both Ryan and Peggy, I think, really hit the nails on the head. I think placing health at the center, and I think this is the moment because everyone is focused, and I think they see the consequences when you don't put health and you don't prioritize facts and science at the center of policy and relationships. And so I think that's definitely the organizing principle that we should take from this conversation. And then hopefully our leaders will pay attention and also move forward to do exactly the things that Ryan said, putting aside the egos and realizing that antagonism is not going to solve urgent problems like solving a global pandemic or addressing global climate change. And so, yeah, and simply we don't have time. We can't continue to go back and forth. And I think there's too much on the line to not work together and to do something and to really, I think, shift course and get back on track because the rest of us depend on it.
Thank you very much. It's been a privilege having this conversation with all of you, truly expert. And I'd like to hand this back to Steve Wagner and our host, Steve.
Thanks so much, Merit. And thank you, of course, to our panelists, Peggy, Angel, Ryan. It was a very thought-provoking discussion. I know we could listen to you all talk for a few more hours, but unfortunately we are out of time. And thanks to all of you in the audience for participating in the final night of the National Committee's 2020 China Town Hall Series. We hope you will continue to join the National Committee's programs in the future as we chart a path forward for the US-China relationship. You might have seen that I posted a link to subscribe to our mailing list in the chat box for anyone interested. And for a full list of our upcoming events, please visit our website, ncuscr.org/events. Thank you so much again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. A real privilege. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.